There is a specific kind of confusion that settles into a person after a relationship ends with someone who struggled to stay close, a confusion that usually centers on one persistent, painful question: did they stop wanting me? It is one of the most natural questions to ask after loss, and it is also, more often than not, the wrong question entirely, because it assumes that wanting and keeping are the same skill, that desire and capacity live in the same place, that if someone truly wanted you enough, they would have automatically known how to hold on to you. This assumption, understandable as it is, causes more unnecessary suffering than almost any other belief people carry out of a difficult relationship, because it turns a limitation that was never about your worth into a verdict about exactly that. This is the story of untangling those two things: attraction and capacity, desire and the actual skill of sustaining closeness, and understanding, clearly and for good, which one was actually missing, and what that distinction means for how you carry this experience forward. Two different things that get confused as one. Attraction is, in many ways, the easiest part of any relationship. It requires no skill, no consistency, no ongoing effort. It simply happens, or it doesn't, triggered by chemistry, timing, compatibility, 100 factors that have nothing to do with a person's actual ability to build and sustain closeness over time. Someone can be enormously attracted to another person, drawn to them in every way that matters on a purely instinctual level, and still be fundamentally unequipped to do the harder, ongoing work that turns attraction into an actual relationship capable of lasting. Capacity is different. Capacity is the accumulated set of skills, emotional tools, and internal safety a person needs in order to stay close to someone once the initial spark of attraction has settled into the longer, more demanding work of real intimacy. It includes the ability to tolerate vulnerability without fleeing from it. It includes the ability to repair after conflict instead of withdrawing into silence. It includes the ability to receive love consistently without becoming overwhelmed by the closeness that love requires. None of this has anything to do with how much someone wants you. All of it has to do with whether they have, through their own life experience, developed the internal architecture required to hold on to what they want once they have it. This distinction matters enormously because so much of the pain that follows a relationship with someone who struggled with closeness gets built on the false premise that these two things are the same, that if the capacity wasn't there, the attraction couldn't have been real either. Once you separate them clearly, a different, more accurate story becomes available, one where you were genuinely wanted, genuinely desired, and still, for reasons that had nothing to do with your worth, not kept, because keeping requires a set of capacities that wanting alone can never supply. What it actually felt like from the inside. If you're reading this, you probably remember exactly what it felt like in the earlier stages of this relationship, the unmistakable sense of being genuinely wanted, pursued, even drawn toward with an intensity that felt real because it was real. This wasn't your imagination. This wasn't wishful thinking projected onto ambiguous behavior. Attraction like that has a specific quality to it, unmistakable in the moment, and the fact that it eventually gave way to withdrawal doesn't retroactively make it fake. It simply means that attraction, on its own, was never going to be enough to sustain what it started. This is worth sitting with directly because so many people in your position spend enormous energy trying to figure out where the attraction went, replaying early memories, searching for the exact moment things changed, as though identifying that moment would somehow explain everything. But the attraction likely didn't go anywhere in the way you're imagining. What changed was not desire. What changed was the demand that closeness placed on a capacity that was never fully developed to meet it, and as that demand increased, as the relationship moved from its easier, earlier stages into the harder, more vulnerable terrain that real intimacy eventually requires, the limitation that was always there became visible in a way it hadn't been before. Understanding this doesn't erase the pain of what happened, but it does relocate the source of that pain to somewhere more accurate and more survivable than the story you might have been telling yourself. You weren't wanted and then discarded because you became less wanted. You were wanted genuinely by someone whose capacity to act on that wanting over time simply wasn't equal to the feeling itself, what capacity is actually made of. It's worth breaking capacity down into its actual components, because the word itself can feel abstract until you see what it's actually built from. Capacity for closeness includes the ability to sit with discomfort without immediately needing to escape it, whether that discomfort comes from conflict, from vulnerability, from someone else's strong emotions, or from your own. It includes the ability to communicate a need directly instead of withdrawing and hoping the other person eventually figures out what's wrong. It includes the ability to receive care without feeling suffocated by it, to be truly seen without experiencing that visibility as a threat. Most people build these capacities gradually over the course of childhood and early relationships, through repeated experiences of being close to someone and discovering that closeness doesn't have to be dangerous, that vulnerability doesn't automatically lead to abandonment or engulfment, that conflict can be survived and even repaired rather than avoided entirely. When these early experiences are inconsistent, when closeness was unpredictable or unsafe in some way during the years these capacities were supposed to develop, the resulting gaps don't disappear in adulthood. They simply become invisible until a relationship demands exactly the capacity that's missing, at which point the gap becomes suddenly, painfully obvious, not because desire has faded, but because the relationship has finally asked for something the person was never equipped to give. This is why relationships with someone who has these particular gaps often follow a familiar arc, an intense, promising beginning full of genuine attraction and connection, followed by a gradual withdrawal that seems to accelerate exactly as the relationship starts asking for more consistency, more vulnerability, more of the ongoing capacity that early infatuation never required. The withdrawal isn't a verdict on you. It's the visible edge of a gap that was always there, simply not yet tested by anything that required more than the relationship's easier, earlier stages. Why this isn't about you, even though it felt like it was. One of the cruelest features of this particular kind of ending is how personal it feels, even though its actual causes have almost nothing to do with anything specific about you. Withdrawal, inconsistency, and eventual distance tend to arrive wrapped in circumstantial detail that makes them feel targeted, specific, a direct response to something about you individually, some flaw or excess or insufficiency that finally became too much for them to handle. This feeling is understandable because relationships are intimate and specific, and it's natural to interpret someone's retreat as a comment on you rather than as a comment on their own internal limitations. But capacity gaps aren't selective in the way this interpretation assumes. A person whose capacity for sustained intimacy is limited will hit the edge of that limitation with almost anyone who gets close enough, regardless of that person's individual qualities, because the limitation lives in them, not in whoever happens to be standing in front of it. This is not a comforting abstraction offered to make you feel better. It's simply the more accurate accounting of what capacity gaps actually are. Internal, portable, present in every close relationship a person enters until the underlying gap itself is addressed, usually through significant intentional work that most people, left to their own patterns, never actually undertake. Understanding this doesn't mean pretending the relationship's specific details didn't matter, or that you have no capacity for growth or change yourself. It means correctly identifying which parts of what happened were actually about you, and which parts were about a limitation that would have surfaced in some form with nearly anyone who got close enough to test it. Most of what you experienced falls into the second category, and recognizing that distinction is one of the most important steps in releasing yourself from a story that was never actually about your worth to begin with. The difference between wanting and choosing. There is a subtle but important distinction between wanting someone and actively choosing them, day after day, through the ordinary friction of real life together. Wanting is a feeling, often intense, often genuine, but ultimately passive, something that happens to a person rather than something they do. Choosing is active. It requires repeated decisions, small and large, to prioritize the relationship, to show up even when showing up is inconvenient, to repair after disappointment instead of retreating from it, to keep offering presence even when presence feels harder than distance would. A person can want someone with real intensity and still fail, repeatedly, to choose them in the ways that actually sustain a relationship over time. This isn't hypocrisy or deception. It's simply the gap between feeling and capacity showing itself in practice. The wanting was never in question. What was in question, and what ultimately determined the relationship's outcome, was whether that wanting could translate into the sustained, active choosing that closeness actually requires, day after day, long after the initial intensity of new attraction has settled into something that demands more deliberate effort to maintain. This distinction matters because it explains a pattern many people recognize but struggle to name, the sense that someone wanted you enormously and still, somehow, didn't stay. Both of these things were true simultaneously, not because the person was lying about their feelings, but because feeling and follow-through are simply not the same capacity, and a person can possess one abundantly while lacking the other almost entirely. Why early intensity isn't a reliable predictor. One of the more painful ironies in relationships like this is that the intensity of the beginning often has little to no bearing on the durability of what follows and can sometimes even work against it. A relationship that starts with overwhelming intensity, rapid closeness, constant contact, and a sense that this connection is unlike anything either person has experienced before can feel in the moment like undeniable proof that this is a special, significant match. But intensity in the early stages often reflects the ease of infatuation rather than any actual test of sustained capacity, because infatuation doesn't yet require the harder skills that longer-term intimacy eventually demands. This is worth understanding clearly because it can help make sense of a confusing pattern. A relationship that felt at its outset more intense and more promising than almost any other relationship you've experienced, ending anyway, not because the connection wasn't real, but because intensity was never actually measuring the thing that determines whether a relationship lasts. What determines longevity is capacity, tested gradually, through the ordinary friction of daily life, through disagreements that need repairing, through vulnerability that needs to be met with steadiness rather than withdrawal. None of this shows up in the early, easier stages of a relationship, which means the early intensity you experienced was never lying to you about attraction. It simply wasn't equipped to tell you anything about capacity at all. Understanding this distinction protects you from a specific kind of self-doubt that tends to follow relationships like this, the tendency to look back at the intense beginning and wonder how something that felt so real could have ended so completely. It felt real because it was real. It ended because the intensity of feeling and the capacity for sustained action were never actually the same thing, and only one of them was ever going to determine whether the relationship could last. The confusion of being left by someone who still seemed to care. Perhaps the most disorienting part of a relationship ending this way is that the withdrawal rarely comes packaged with a clear, unambiguous loss of care. Often there are still moments of genuine warmth even as the distance grows, still flashes of the connection that first drew you together, still evidence, confusing and painful in equal measure, that something real remains even as the relationship itself becomes unsustainable. This mixed signal is one of the hardest parts to process, because it doesn't fit the simpler story of someone who simply stopped caring and walked away cleanly. What's actually happening in cases like this is that care and capacity are simply operating on different tracks, and a person can genuinely continue to care about someone while remaining unable to offer the sustained presence that caring, on its own, doesn't automatically produce. This isn't manipulation, and it isn't necessarily even conscious on their part. It's simply the visible evidence of two different systems, one emotional and one practical, that don't always move in sync, especially in someone whose capacity for sustained closeness has significant gaps in it. Recognizing this can help make sense of a period that otherwise feels contradictory and confusing, moments of real connection interspersed with withdrawal, apparent care, alongside apparent absence. Both were probably real. The care didn't have to be fake for the relationship to have failed, and understanding that both things coexisted, sometimes simultaneously, can help you stop searching for a single, coherent explanation that would require one of those two truths to have been dishonest all along. Untangling your worth from their limitation. For a long time after a relationship like this ends, it's common to search for evidence of your own inadequacy, replaying interactions, wondering if you were too much in some moments and not enough in others, constructing an entire theory of what you could have done differently to keep someone who, in reality, was never going to be kept by anything you see. Would have done because the limitation preventing that outcome lived entirely inside them, built out of their own history, their own unaddressed patterns, their own underdeveloped capacity for sustained closeness. This search for personal fault is one of the most common and most unnecessary forms of suffering that follows relationships like this, and it deserves to be interrupted directly. Your worth was never actually on trial in this relationship, even though it might have felt that way throughout its unraveling. What was being tested, unknowingly, was someone else's internal capacity, a capacity that had nothing to do with your qualities, your effort, or your value as a partner. You could have been more patient, more understanding, more accommodating, and none of it would have changed the fundamental limitation at play, because that limitation wasn't a response to anything you did or didn't do. It was simply a pre-existing gap that the relationship eventually asked something of that it couldn't supply. Separating your worth from their limitation is one of the most important pieces of healing available to you now. It requires actively countering the instinct to search for your own fault whenever this relationship comes to mind, replacing that instinct with a more accurate accounting of what actually happened. You were someone capable of real intimacy, offering real care to someone whose own capacity for receiving and sustaining that care was limited by factors that existed long before you ever entered the picture, and that will likely continue to exist in some form long after you're gone from it too. What you couldn't have done differently. There is a particular kind of torment available to anyone who loved someone with limited capacity for sustained closeness, the endless replaying of what might have gone differently if you had said something sooner, given more space, given less space, been more direct, been softer, done anything at all differently than what you actually did. This replaying rests on a false premise, that the outcome was within your control to begin with, that the right combination of behavior on your part could have unlocked a capacity that simply wasn't there to be unlocked. The truth, difficult as it is to accept, is that you likely couldn't have done anything meaningfully different that would have changed the fundamental outcome. Capacity gaps of the kind that determine whether a relationship survives its harder, more vulnerable stages are not typically resolved by a partner's patience, communication skill, or accommodation, however excellent those qualities might be. They are resolved, when they're resolved at all, through the other person's own sustained internal work that requires their own willingness to recognize the gap, their own commitment to address it, often over a period of years, frequently with professional support. This work was never something you could do on their behalf, no matter how much you loved them or how skillfully you tried. Releasing yourself from the belief that you could have changed the outcome through different behavior is one of the more freeing realizations available in this healing process. It doesn't mean nothing about your own behavior in the relationship is worth examining or learning from. It means recognizing that the core outcome, the ultimate limitation that determined whether the relationship could sustain itself, was never actually within your power to change, and holding yourself responsible for an outcome you never had the power to control is simply unnecessary suffering added onto an already difficult loss. The grief of loving someone who couldn't meet you. It's worth naming honestly that this particular kind of loss carries its own specific grief, different in texture from grieving someone who simply stopped caring. You're not just grieving the end of a relationship. You're grieving the gap between what someone was capable of feeling and what they were capable of doing about it, a gap that means you were, in a real sense, loved by someone incapable of fully showing up for that love, which is its own particular kind of loss, distinct from being unloved entirely. This grief deserves space and acknowledgement rather than being rushed past in favor of the more straightforward, less complicated stories people sometimes prefer to tell about breakups. You are allowed to grieve someone who genuinely cared about you and still couldn't offer what a relationship actually required. You are allowed to hold both truths simultaneously, the reality of their care and the reality of their limitation, without needing to resolve the tension between them into a simpler, more comfortable narrative. Grief that holds this complexity honestly tends to move through you more completely than grief built on an oversimplified story that doesn't match what you actually experienced. Give yourself permission to grieve this specific loss on its own terms, distinct from other kinds of heartbreak you might have experienced before. It is genuinely difficult to love someone whose capacity couldn't meet the depth of what they felt, and that difficulty deserves to be honored rather than minimized, even as you work, simultaneously, toward the clarity and peace this entire process is ultimately building toward. Building the capacity you deserve in a partner. Having lived through the confusion of loving someone whose capacity couldn't match his attraction to you, it becomes possible over time to develop a much clearer sense of what actual capacity looks like in practice, the kind you deserve to receive from a partner going forward. This means learning to look past the intensity of early attraction and pay closer attention to how someone handles the harder, less flattering moments that any relationship eventually requires. How they respond to conflict, whether they repair after disappointing you, whether they can tolerate your vulnerability without pulling away from it, whether their words about wanting closeness are matched by consistent behavior that actually builds it. This kind of discernment doesn't develop automatically. It develops through the direct, sometimes painful experience of having loved someone who lacked it, an experience that, however difficult, leaves you with a far more accurate internal model of what capacity actually looks like than you had before. You now know from lived experience the specific gap between someone who wants you and someone who can actually sustain closeness with you over time, and that knowledge becomes one of the most valuable tools you carry into every future relationship. Going forward, this means paying attention not just to how someone makes you feel in the exciting, easier early stages, but to how they behave when things get harder, when vulnerability is required, when conflict needs to be worked through rather than avoided. These are the moments that actually reveal capacity, and learning to weight them appropriately, rather than being swept along by the intensity of early attraction alone, is one of the most protective skills you can develop as you move forward from this experience. What healthy capacity actually looks like. It's worth painting a clear picture of what healthy relational capacity actually looks like in practice, because it's easy to know what you don't want without having a clear enough sense of what you're actually looking for instead. Healthy capacity looks like someone who can sit with your disappointment without needing to fix it immediately or flee from it entirely. It looks like someone who initiates repair after conflict rather than waiting for you to do all the emotional labor of reconnecting. It looks like someone whose actions over time consistently match their words, someone who shows up reliably rather than intensely and inconsistently. Healthy capacity also looks like someone who can receive your vulnerability without becoming overwhelmed by it, who can hear that something you did hurt them without either exploding or completely withdrawing, who can tolerate the ordinary friction of two people building a life together without treating every disagreement as a threat to the relationship's survival. This kind of capacity isn't dramatic or particularly exciting in the way early infatuation often is. It tends to feel, instead, remarkably calm, steady, almost undramatic in its consistency, which can actually be disorienting if you're used to relationships characterized by intensity and unpredictability. Learning to recognize and value this kind of steadiness, rather than mistaking its calmness for a lack of depth or passion, is one of the more important recalibrations available to you now. Real capacity often looks less exciting on the surface than the intense, unpredictable dynamics you might have grown accustomed to, but it is, in every way that actually matters over time, far more valuable and far more capable of sustaining the kind of deep, lasting closeness you actually deserve. Choosing partners for capacity, not just chemistry. One of the most practical shifts available to you, going forward, is learning to weigh capacity alongside chemistry when evaluating potential partners, rather than letting chemistry alone drive your decisions the way it may have in the past. Chemistry is real and worth valuing, but on its own, it tells you almost nothing about whether someone has the capacity to sustain what that chemistry initially promises. Learning to ask different questions early on about how someone handles conflict, how they talk about their past relationships, whether they take responsibility for their own patterns or consistently blame previous partners for everything that went wrong, gives you far more useful information than intensity of attraction ever could on its own. This doesn't mean abandoning chemistry as a factor in who you choose to pursue. It means holding chemistry alongside a genuine evaluation of capacity, refusing to let intensity override everything else the way it might have before. A person can be wonderful, kind, and genuinely attracted to you, and still lack the capacity your relationship actually requires, and learning to notice this distinction early, before significant investment has already occurred, protects you from repeating a pattern that cost you real time and real pain to learn the first time around. This recalibration takes practice, especially if chemistry has historically been your primary compass for who to pursue. But it develops gradually the same way every other skill described throughout this piece develops, through repeated, deliberate attention, until eventually it becomes second nature, informing your choices automatically rather than requiring conscious effort each time a new person enters your life. The freedom of understanding this distinction. There is a real and significant freedom available once you fully internalize the distinction between attraction and capacity, a freedom that changes how you carry this entire experience forward. You no longer have to wonder what was wrong with you, because the question itself no longer makes sense once you understand that the outcome was never actually about your worth or your desirability. You no longer have to search for the moment things changed, because you understand now that nothing fundamental changed at all, that the limitation was present from the beginning, simply invisible until the relationship's demands finally exposed it. This freedom extends into how you view your own past behavior in the relationship too. You no longer need to audit every choice you made, every message you sent, every moment you were perhaps too eager or too withdrawn, searching for the specific mistake that cost you the relationship. There likely wasn't one. The relationship's outcome was determined by a capacity gap that existed independently of your behavior, and once you fully accept this, an enormous amount of unnecessary self-scrutiny simply becomes unnecessary, freed up for something more useful than endless retrospective analysis of a situation that was never actually within your control to change. This freedom is one of the most valuable outcomes of fully understanding the distinction this piece has been describing throughout. It doesn't erase the pain of the loss, but it does relocate that pain to somewhere more accurate and, ultimately, more survivable than the story of personal inadequacy you might have been carrying without fully realizing it. Trusting your own capacity to be loved well. Alongside everything this piece has described about understanding someone else's limitation, it's worth turning attention toward your own capacity, specifically your capacity to be loved well, fully, and consistently by someone actually equipped to offer that. It's common, after a relationship like this ends, to internalize the confusion of the experience as evidence that you're somehow difficult to love properly, that your needs are excessive, that the inconsistency you experienced says something about how lovable you actually are. None of this follows logically from what actually happened, but the feeling can persist anyway, quietly shaping your expectations for what future relationships might offer you. Trusting your own capacity to be loved well means actively countering this internalized doubt with a more accurate accounting of your own value as a partner. You showed up. You offered real care, real patience, real effort toward building something lasting. The fact that this effort wasn't met with equal capacity from the other person says nothing about whether you deserve to be met that way by someone else. Your capacity to give love well is not in question here. What was in question and what ultimately determined the outcome was someone else's capacity to receive and sustain it, a capacity that had nothing to do with you. Rebuilding this trust in your own worthiness of being loved well takes time, especially if the relationship's ending left you with lingering doubts you haven't yet fully examined. But it's worth doing deliberately, actively countering the doubt whenever it surfaces with the clearer, more accurate story this piece has been building throughout. You are capable of real, sustained love, and you deserve to receive it from someone equally capable of offering it back. What this means for the relationships you build next. Everything described throughout this piece changes, in practical ways, how you'll approach relationships going forward. You'll bring a sharper eye for the difference between intensity and capacity, less likely to mistake overwhelming early attraction for genuine relationship readiness. You'll bring a clearer sense of what to actually watch for, how someone handles conflict, whether their actions match their words over time, whether they can tolerate vulnerability without withdrawing from it. This isn't cynicism about future relationships. It's discernment earned through direct experience that will protect you from investing deeply in dynamics that were never going to develop the sustained capacity you actually need. You'll also bring a healthier relationship with your own worth, no longer contingent on whether a particular relationship succeeded or failed, understanding now that outcomes like this one are determined by factors that exist independently of your value as a partner. This understanding frees you to enter new relationships without the quiet fear that you'll somehow cause the same outcome again through some flaw in your own approach, because you understand now clearly that the flaw was never yours to begin with. Whoever comes next in your life will be meeting a version of you shaped by this understanding, not damaged by it. You'll approach new connections with genuine openness, tempered by real discernment, no longer swept along purely by intensity, but also attentive to the steadier, less dramatic signs of actual capacity. This combination, openness paired with discernment, is exactly what protects you from repeating this particular pattern while still remaining fully available to the genuine, sustainable love you deserve. Why some people never develop this capacity. It's worth understanding, in general terms, why some people go through life without ever fully developing the capacity for sustained intimacy, not to excuse the pain this caused you, but to help you release any remaining confusion about why someone who clearly cared couldn't ultimately meet you. Capacity for closeness develops, for most people, through a combination of early experience and ongoing intentional effort, and when either of these is significantly disrupted, whether through inconsistent caregiving in childhood, through repeated relational trauma, or simply through never having had a model of what healthy closeness actually looks like, the resulting gaps can persist well into adulthood without the person even fully recognizing they exist. Many people carrying these gaps aren't consciously aware of them in any detailed way. They may simply experience closeness as increasingly uncomfortable the deeper it goes, without understanding why, attributing that discomfort to something about the specific relationship or the specific partner, rather than recognizing it as a pattern rooted in their own unaddressed history. This lack of self-awareness doesn't make the pattern less painful for the person on the receiving end of it, but it does help explain why someone might genuinely care about you and still be unable to identify or address the exact thing standing between that care and their ability to act on it consistently. Addressing these gaps typically requires significant, sustained effort, therapy, honest self-examination, a genuine willingness to sit with discomfort long enough to understand its source rather than fleeing from it every time it arises. Many people never undertake this work, not necessarily out of malice or indifference, but because the work itself requires a level of vulnerability that the very gap in question makes difficult to access. This is not your responsibility to manage or resolve on anyone's behalf. It's simply useful context for understanding why the pattern persisted despite genuine care being present throughout. The specific pain of watching someone choose their fear over you. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from recognizing, in retrospect, that someone's withdrawal wasn't really about choosing something or someone else over you, but about their own fear winning out over their own genuine desire to stay close. This can feel in some ways even more painful than a clean rejection, because it means you were competing not against another person or another priority, but against an internal pattern that had nothing to do with your value and everything to do with a fear response they may not have even fully understood themselves. Watching this play out, especially if you had any visibility into their internal struggle, their apparent awareness that they were pulling away from something they actually wanted, adds a specific layer of grief to the experience. You may have witnessed real distress in them as they withdrew, real evidence that some part of them recognized what they were losing and still couldn't stop the pattern from playing out. This is genuinely difficult to witness, and it's worth acknowledging that difficulty honestly rather than minimizing it in favor of a simpler story where the ending was clean and uncomplicated. What this pain ultimately points toward, though, is further confirmation of everything this piece has been describing. The outcome was determined by an internal capacity, or its absence, not by any deficiency in what you offered. Watching someone lose a battle against their own fear is heartbreaking, but it's also, in its own way, clarifying. It confirms that you weren't defeated by anything about yourself. You were present for a battle that was always going to be theirs to fight, when you couldn't have fought on their behalf no matter how much you loved them or how much you wished you could have. Redefining what being chosen actually requires. Part of healing from this experience involves redefining what being chosen actually requires from a partner, moving away from a definition based purely on intensity of feeling and toward one based on sustained, consistent action over time. Being chosen in the way that actually matters for building a lasting relationship doesn't just mean someone feels a strong pull toward you. It means they consistently act on that pull, show up reliably, prioritize the relationship even when doing so requires effort or discomfort, repair after disappointing you rather than retreating into distance. This redefinition matters because it protects you from being satisfied in future relationships by intensity alone, without requiring the sustained action that actually constitutes being genuinely chosen. You now understand from direct and painful experience that feeling wanted intensely in the early stages of a relationship is not the same as being chosen consistently over the long term, and this understanding raises your standard for what you'll actually accept as evidence of someone's commitment going forward. Holding yourself to this higher standard isn't about becoming distrustful or overly guarded. It's about becoming accurate, refusing to mistake the easier, more exciting signals of early attraction for the harder, more meaningful evidence of sustained capacity that actually determines whether a relationship can last. This accuracy protects you from investing deeply, again, in a dynamic that offers intensity without capacity, ensuring that the next time you feel chosen, that feeling is backed by the kind of consistent action that actually earns your trust rather than simply your hope. What remains true about the love you offered? Whatever confusion or pain remains from this experience, one thing deserves to remain completely clear and unquestioned. The love you offered throughout this relationship was real, valuable, and worth having received well. The fact that it wasn't received as fully as it deserved to be doesn't diminish its quality or its worth. You gave something genuine, something significant to someone who, for reasons entirely their own, couldn't fully receive or sustain what you were offering. This doesn't reflect any deficiency in what you gave. It reflects, only and entirely, a limitation in their own capacity to receive it. This distinction is worth holding on to firmly, because it's easy, in the aftermath of a relationship like this, to start doubting the value of what you offered simply because it didn't produce the outcome you hoped for. But value isn't determined by outcome alone. A genuine, generous offering of love remains genuine and generous regardless of whether the person receiving it was equipped to hold on to it. You didn't do anything wrong by loving fully. You simply loved someone whose capacity to meet that fullness was limited, and that limitation belongs entirely to them, not to any flaw in what you gave. Carry this understanding forward as a foundation for how you view your own capacity to love in future relationships. What you offered here was real and valuable, and it will remain real and valuable when you offer it again, to someone actually capable of receiving and sustaining it the way it deserves to be received. Nothing about this experience diminishes that capacity in you. If anything, having survived loving someone who couldn't fully meet you, and coming out the other side still capable of genuine love and openness, is itself powerful evidence of exactly how real and resilient that capacity actually is. The body's memory of being wanted and not kept. There's often a physical residue that lingers after a relationship like this ends, a body that remembers being wanted intensely and then not kept, a nervous system that may have learned, without your conscious awareness, to associate intense early attraction with eventual loss, bracing now for a familiar pattern even in situations where that pattern isn't actually present. This physical memory deserves attention because it can quietly shape how you experience new relationships going forward, even after your conscious understanding of what happened has become clear and accurate. You might notice in a new relationship an unexpected wave of anxiety exactly when things start to feel intense and promising, your body flagging a familiar pattern before your mind has had time to evaluate whether the pattern actually applies to this new situation. This isn't a sign that something is wrong with the new relationship. It's evidence of a nervous system that learned, through real experience, to treat intensity as a predictor of eventual loss, and that learning takes time and repeated new evidence to unlearn, separate from the cognitive understanding you've already built through everything described throughout this piece. Working with this physical memory, rather than being frustrated by its persistence, means noticing when it arises, naming it gently to yourself as an old pattern responding to a new situation, and giving your body repeated experiences of intensity followed by consistency, rather than intensity followed by withdrawal, until the old association gradually loosens its grip. This process takes time, and it's worth being patient with yourself as it unfolds, understanding that your body is simply catching up to a truth your mind has already grasped, the truth that not every intense connection is destined to end the way this one did. How to tell the difference going forward. It's worth offering something more concrete here, a practical guide for distinguishing genuine capacity from mere attraction as you move into future relationships, because abstract understanding is most useful when it translates into actual, applicable discernment. Pay attention early on to how someone talks about their past relationships. Do they take any responsibility for their own patterns, or is every previous relationship's failure attributed entirely to the other person? A consistent inability to acknowledge any personal contribution to past relational difficulties is often a meaningful signal about someone's current capacity for self-awareness and growth. Pay attention, too, to how someone handles small moments of friction early in the relationship, not the big, dramatic tests, but the small, everyday ones. A canceled plan, a miscommunication, a moment of mild disappointment. Do they engage with the discomfort directly, communicating honestly about what happened, or do they withdraw, go quiet, or deflect responsibility? These small moments, easy to overlook amid the excitement of a new connection, often reveal far more about someone's actual capacity than any grand romantic gesture ever could. Notice, too, whether someone's actions consistently match their words over time, not just in a single instance but across a pattern of behavior. Someone with genuine capacity for closeness will, more often than not, follow through on what they say, showing up reliably rather than making promises during moments of intensity that later prove inconsistent with their actual behavior. Building this kind of attentive observation into how you evaluate new relationships protects you, going forward, from repeating a pattern that cost you real time and real pain to recognize the first time. The empowerment of no longer needing an explanation. One of the more freeing outcomes of fully understanding the distinction between attraction and capacity is that you no longer need a detailed explanation from the person involved in order to make peace with what happened. You already have the explanation, built out of your own understanding of how attraction and capacity actually work, and that understanding is sufficient, complete, and entirely independent of whether the other person ever offers their own account of what happened or why. This matters because waiting for an external explanation keeps you tethered to someone who may never actually provide one, either because they lack the self-awareness to articulate what happened clearly, or because doing so would require a level of vulnerability their own capacity gaps make difficult to access. You are no longer waiting for that explanation because you've built your own, more accurate than anything they could likely offer anyway, grounded in a genuine understanding of relational psychology rather than in whatever partial, possibly defensive account they might eventually provide. This self-generated clarity is one of the most valuable outcomes of the process this piece has been describing throughout. It means your healing doesn't depend on their insight, their willingness to communicate, or their own eventual understanding of what happened. It depends entirely on your own clarity, already built, already sufficient, already carrying you forward into a peace that doesn't require anything further from someone who was never actually capable of consistently providing what you needed in the first place. What attraction without capacity actually costs a relationship? It's worth being specific about what attraction without capacity actually costs, in practical terms, over the life of a relationship, because understanding this cost clearly helps explain why so many relationships that begin with such promise ultimately fail to sustain themselves. Attraction without capacity produces a relationship where one person, usually the one with greater capacity, ends up doing a disproportionate share of the emotional labor required to keep the connection functioning. They initiate the difficult conversations. They pursue repair after conflict. They extend patience and understanding far beyond what should reasonably be required, because someone has to hold the relationship together, and the other person's capacity gap means they aren't equipped to share that weight equally. Over time, this imbalance produces a predictable outcome. The person carrying the disproportionate weight becomes exhausted, resentful, or both, while the person with the capacity gap experiences the relationship as increasingly overwhelming despite doing comparatively little of the actual labor required to sustain it, because even their smaller share of the work exceeds what they're underdeveloped. Capacity can comfortably handle. This dynamic explains why relationships like this so often end not with a dramatic rupture but with a slow, mutual exhaustion, one person depleted by overfunctioning, the other overwhelmed despite underfunctioning, both moving toward an ending that neither necessarily wanted but that the underlying imbalance made close to inevitable. Recognizing this pattern helps explain your own experience without requiring you to search for a more dramatic, more personal explanation for why things fell apart. The relationship's ending wasn't really about a single decisive moment or a specific mistake either of you made. It was the natural, almost mathematical result of an imbalance between attraction and capacity that was present from the beginning, simply not yet visible until the relationship had accumulated enough weight to reveal exactly where that imbalance lived. Learning to recognize your own overfunctioning. If the pattern described throughout this piece resonates with your own experience, it's worth turning attention, honestly, toward your own role in the imbalance, not to assign yourself blame for an outcome that was never fully within your control, but to build self-awareness that will protect you in future relationships. Many people who love someone with limited relational capacity respond, understandably, by overfunctioning, taking on more and more of the relationship's emotional labor in an attempt to compensate for what the other person isn't providing, often without fully realizing how much they've taken on until exhaustion finally forces the imbalance into visibility. Recognizing your own tendency toward overfunctioning, if it's present, isn't about blaming yourself for the relationship's outcome. It's about understanding a pattern in your own behavior that, left unaddressed, could repeat itself in future relationships, potentially with a different partner, but the same underlying dynamic of you doing disproportionate labor to hold something together that should have been more evenly shared from the start. This recognition is protective, not self-critical, offering you the chance to build different habits going forward, ones that don't require you to constantly compensate for a partner's underdeveloped capacity in order to keep a relationship functioning. Building this self-awareness means learning to notice, early in future relationships, whether you're beginning to take on a disproportionate share of the relationship's emotional labor, and addressing that imbalance directly rather than simply absorbing it the way you might have before. This is one of the more valuable, practical lessons available from everything you've been through, a lesson that will serve you well beyond this particular relationship and into every close connection you build for the rest of your life. The relief of no longer auditioning for someone else's capacity. There is a specific relief available once you fully release the belief that your job was ever to somehow unlock or build someone else's capacity for closeness through your own patience, love, or effort. For a long time, without necessarily naming it this way, you may have been operating as though enough love, enough understanding, enough patience on your part would eventually produce the capacity that wasn't naturally present, as though you were auditioning not just for their affection, but for their ability to actually sustain a relationship with you, hoping that sufficient effort on your end will somehow generate a result that was never actually yours to produce. Releasing this belief is enormously freeing, because it means you no longer have to audition for anyone's capacity going forward. You can simply observe whether capacity is present, honestly and clearly, without taking on the exhausting, ultimately fruitless project of trying to build it in someone through your own effort. Capacity, as this piece has described throughout, develops through a person's own internal work, not through their partner's patience or love, however genuine and generous that patience and love might be. Understanding this distinction protects you from ever again investing years of effort into a project that was never actually within your power to complete. This relief extends into how you evaluate every future connection. Instead of asking whether you can help someone develop the capacity a relationship requires, you can simply ask whether that capacity is already present, built through their own prior work, ready to meet you where you actually are rather than requiring you to wait, hope, and labor for development that may never actually arrive. This is a far more sustainable, far less exhausting way to approach relationships, and it's one of the most valuable shifts available to you now that you fully understand the distinction this piece has been describing throughout. What genuine capacity feels like when you finally experience it. For those who eventually find themselves in a relationship with someone who genuinely possesses the capacity this piece has been describing throughout, the difference is often striking, sometimes almost disorienting, precisely because it feels so much calmer and less dramatic than what came before. Genuine capacity feels like consistency that doesn't require constant reassurance seeking on your part, because the reassurance is simply present, built into the relationship's ordinary rhythm rather than something you have to extract through anxious vigilance. It feels like conflict that resolves rather than accumulates, disagreements that lead to greater understanding rather than distance, vulnerability that gets met with steadiness rather than withdrawal. This calmness can initially feel unfamiliar, even slightly underwhelming, if you've grown accustomed to relationships characterized by intensity and unpredictability. It's worth resisting the temptation to interpret this calmness as a lack of depth or passion, understanding instead that genuine capacity often produces exactly this kind of undramatic steadiness, not because the connection lacks intensity, but because that intensity is no longer competing with anxiety, uncertainty, or the constant low hum of wondering whether the relationship will hold together you. Endure pressure. When you do experience genuine capacity in a partner, let yourself actually receive it fully, without the reflexive suspicion that might arise from prior experience with someone who couldn't offer the same. This is one of the more challenging adjustments available in this process, learning to trust steadiness rather than waiting anxiously for it to reveal itself as another version of the inconsistency you experienced before. But this trust is worth building deliberately, because genuine capacity, once you learn to recognize and receive it, offers a quality of relationship far more sustaining and far more peaceful than anything intensity alone was ever capable of providing. Why you don't need to fix anyone to deserve love. It's worth naming directly a belief that sometimes develops quietly in people who have loved someone with limited capacity. The belief that love itself requires a kind of ongoing repair project, that being genuinely valuable to a partner means being useful in helping them overcome their limitations, that your worth in a relationship is measured by how much healing you can facilitate in someone else. This belief, however unconsciously held, sets you up for exactly the exhausting dynamic this piece has been describing throughout, one where your role becomes therapeutic rather than reciprocal, where your value gets tied to your usefulness in someone else's growth rather than simply existing on its own terms. You don't need to fix anyone to deserve love. You don't need to be someone's healing project, their patient teacher, their consistent source of the security they never developed elsewhere. You deserve a relationship where your presence is enough on its own, where you're not required to also serve as an unpaid, unacknowledged therapist for a partner's unaddressed patterns. This distinction matters enormously, because relationships built around one partner helping the other develop basic relational capacity are, almost by definition, imbalanced from the start, asking far more of one person than the other in ways that tend to produce exactly the exhaustion and eventual dissolution this piece has already described. Releasing the belief that your value lies in your capacity to fix or heal someone else frees you to seek relationships built on a different foundation entirely, one where both partners arrive already equipped with the basic capacity a relationship requires, where your role is to build something together rather than to single-handedly develop the foundation the other person should have brought with them. This is not a smaller, less generous way of loving. It's a healthier one, and it's the kind of love you actually deserve to receive. The long view of what you've learned. Stepping back from the specific relationship this piece has been discussing throughout, it's worth taking the longer view of what this entire experience has taught you, lessons that will serve you far beyond this one chapter and into every relationship you build for the rest of your life. You've learned to distinguish between attraction and capacity, a distinction many people never fully grasp until they've lived through exactly what you've lived through. You've learned to recognize the early signs of a capacity gap, the withdrawal that intensifies as vulnerability deepens, the mismatch between words and consistent action, the pattern of care coexisting with an inability to sustain closeness over time. You've also learned something more personal and more valuable, that you are capable of loving deeply, generously, and genuinely, even when that love isn't met with equal capacity in return, and that surviving this experience hasn't diminished your capacity to love again. If anything, it has sharpened your discernment, giving you a far more accurate internal model of what genuine capacity actually looks like, one built out of direct comparison to its absence rather than out of theory or hope alone. This long view matters because it reframes the entire experience, not as a story of personal failure or inadequacy, but as a difficult, valuable education in exactly the kind of discernment that will protect and serve you going forward. You paid a real cost to learn these lessons, and that cost deserves acknowledgement. But the lessons themselves are genuinely valuable, and carrying them forward, rather than simply carrying forward the pain of how they were learned, is one of the most important choices available to you now. Sitting with the question of what they're capable of now. It's natural, even after everything described throughout this piece, to occasionally wonder whether the person from this relationship has since developed the capacity they lacked while you were together, whether time, or a new relationship, or some personal growth has changed the underlying limitation that determined your own experience with them. This question deserves a clear, honest answer. It doesn't matter, not because their potential growth isn't real or possible, but because your healing was never actually contingent on knowing the answer to it. Whether or not someone eventually develops greater capacity, whether they do that work alone or within a future relationship, whether they ever fully understand what happened between the two of you, none of it changes the accuracy of what this piece has described about your own experience. You loved someone whose capacity, at the time you knew them, didn't match their attraction to you. That was true regardless of what happens afterward in their own separate life and separate growth, and your piece doesn't require tracking whether that truth remains true indefinitely or eventually changes for someone else's benefit. If you notice yourself wondering about this, gently redirect your attention back to your own life, your own growth, your own healing, none of which depends on an answer to a question about someone else's future capacity. Their potential growth, if it happens, is not something you're owed access to, and it's not something your own peace requires. You've already built the understanding and clarity you need, independently of anything they do or don't eventually become capable of. What it means to finally feel chosen well. There is a particular, specific feeling that comes with finally being chosen well, by someone whose capacity fully matches their attraction to you, and it's worth describing clearly here, because it can be difficult to imagine accurately until you've actually experienced it, especially after a relationship where wanting and keeping were so painfully mismatched. Being chosen well feels like consistency you don't have to monitor for, security that doesn't require constant vigilance to confirm, a sense that you can relax into the relationship rather than needing to stay alert for the withdrawal that never seems to fully arrive, because there's simply nothing underneath the relationship's steadiness that's straining to pull away. This feeling is worth holding as a genuine goal, not an idealistic fantasy, but an actually achievable outcome available to you once you've built the discernment this piece has described throughout. You are not asking for too much by wanting to be chosen this way. You are asking for exactly what a healthy relationship is supposed to offer, and the fact that you didn't receive it in this particular relationship says nothing about whether it's available to you elsewhere. with someone whose capacity has actually developed enough to sustain what their attraction to you initially promises. Trust that this feeling is available to you, built out of everything you've learned through this difficult experience. You now know how to recognize it when it arrives, informed by direct comparison to its absence, equipped with a discernment that will help you notice genuine capacity far more quickly than you might have before this entire process began. This is one of the most valuable, most hopeful outcomes of everything described throughout this piece, and it's worth carrying forward with real confidence rather than lingering doubt. A word about patience with your own healing. As you move through the process this piece has been describing, understanding the distinction between attraction and capacity, releasing yourself from unnecessary self-blame, rebuilding trust in your own worth and your own discernment, it's worth acknowledging that this process doesn't happen instantly, regardless of how clearly it can be explained in WR. Understanding a concept intellectually and fully integrating it emotionally are two different things, and the gap between them often requires real time, real repetition, and real patience with yourself, as the understanding gradually settles into something more than just an idea you've read about once. Be patient with the parts of this process that take longer than you'd like, the moments when old self-doubt resurfaces despite your clearer understanding, the times when you catch yourself falling back into old patterns of searching for personal fault in an outcome that was never actually about your worth. This doesn't mean you're failing to heal correctly. It means healing, like most meaningful growth, tends to happen gradually, through repeated practice rather than a single moment of clarity, however genuine and valuable that initial clarity might be. Trust that the understanding described throughout this piece will continue to deepen with time, becoming more fully integrated the more you practice applying it to your own experience, the more you notice yourself choosing accurate self-compassion over old, inaccurate self-blame. This is a process worth being patient with, not because the destination is uncertain, but because meaningful, lasting change of this kind rarely arrives all at once, and giving yourself the grace to move through it at whatever pace it actually requires is itself part of the healing this entire piece has been describing. The version of you that existed before the doubt. Before this relationship, before the confusion of loving someone whose capacity couldn't match his attraction to you, there was a version of you who moved through the world with a more intact sense of her own worth, less shaped by questions of what she might have done wrong, more confident in her own value independent of any single relationship's it's worth remembering that version of yourself now, not as someone permanently lost to this experience, but as someone still fully accessible, waiting to be fully reoccupied once the confusion this relationship generated has been sufficiently untangled. The doubt you may be carrying now, the questions about your own worth, your own desirability, your own capacity to be loved well, are not permanent features of who you are. They are temporary residue from an experience that generated genuine confusion this piece has been working throughout to clear away. Underneath that residue, the version of you who existed before this doubt remains fully intact, simply waiting for the fog to clear enough for her to become visible again, fully confident in her own worth, unshaken by an outcome that, as this piece has explained at length, was never actually about her value to begin with. Returning to that version of yourself doesn't require becoming someone new or fundamentally different from who you were before this relationship began. It requires simply clearing away the accumulated confusion and doubt this experience generated, allowing the clearer, more accurate understanding of what actually happened to replace the distorted story you might have been carrying without fully realizing it. She's still there. She was never actually gone. She was simply waiting for this clarity to become fully available. What you deserve going forward. Having moved through everything described throughout this piece, it's worth stating plainly and directly what you actually deserve going forward, not as an abstract aspiration, but as a concrete standard worth holding future relationships to. You deserve a partner whose attraction to you is matched by genuine capacity to sustain closeness over time, not just in the exciting early stages, but through the harder, more vulnerable terrain that real intimacy eventually requires. You deserve consistency that doesn't require your constant vigilance to maintain, repair that comes from both sides after conflict, vulnerability that gets met with steadiness rather than withdrawal. You deserve to be chosen not just in feeling, but in sustained action, day after day, through the ordinary friction of building a life together. You deserve a relationship where your own emotional labor is matched by equal effort from your partner, not one where you're left doing the disproportionate work of holding the connection together while your partner's underdeveloped capacity leaves them unable to share that weight equally. You deserve simply to be loved by someone actually equipped to love you the way you're capable of loving in return. Hold this standard clearly and without apology as you move forward. You are not asking for too much. You are asking for exactly what a healthy relationship is supposed to offer, and everything you've learned through this difficult experience has equipped you to recognize it, pursue it, and receive it fully when it finally arrives, built on a foundation of genuine capacity rather than intensity alone. Closing, the truth worth carrying forward. If there is a single truth worth carrying forward from everything this piece has described, let it be this. You were genuinely wanted, and you were still not kept, and these two facts were never actually in contradiction with each other. They simply reflect the difference between attraction, which requires nothing but chemistry and timing, and capacity, which requires sustained internal work that not everyone has done, regardless of how genuinely they might want to keep the person standing in front of them. This distinction was never about your worth. It was always about a limitation that existed independently of you, present before you arrived and likely to persist in some form after you're gone. You carry forward from this experience not diminishment but discernment, not doubt about your own value but a clearer, more accurate understanding of what genuine relational capacity actually looks like, an understanding that will protect and serve you in every future relationship you build. You are capable of deep, genuine love, and you deserve to have that love met by someone equally capable of sustaining it, not just feeling it in the moment, but choosing it, actively and consistently, for as long as the relationship requires that choosing to continue. This is where the story actually ends, not with a verdict about your worth, but with a clearer, more accurate understanding of what actually happened, one that frees you to move forward fully intact toward the kind of love you've always deserved, offered by someone whose capacity finally matches the depth of what they feel for you. The question of whether they knew. One of the more persistent questions that lingers after a relationship like this is whether the other person actually knew, at some level, that their capacity couldn't sustain what their attraction had promised, whether they saw the mismatch developing in real time and simply couldn't find a way to address it, or whether they remained genuinely unaware of the gap. Until it had already done its damage, this question can feel important to resolve, as though the answer would change how you should feel about what happened, but it's worth recognizing that the answer, whatever it might be, doesn't actually change the practical reality of your own experience or the healing this piece has been describing. If they knew and said nothing, that reflects a specific kind of avoidance, a fear of confronting their own limitation directly enough to communicate it honestly, which is itself simply another expression of the same underlying capacity gap this piece has already discussed at length. If they didn't know if the mismatch was genuinely invisible to them until it had already unfolded, that reflects a different kind of limitation, a lack of self-awareness that, while perhaps more forgivable in some abstract sense, still produced the same practical outcome for you either way. Neither answer changes what you experienced, and neither answer requires you to feel differently about your own worth or your own choices throughout the relationship. Releasing the need to know which scenario actually applies is part of the broader release this piece has been describing throughout, the release from needing external confirmation or explanation in order to make peace with what happened. You don't need to know what they knew or when they knew it. You already have everything you need to understand and move forward from this experience, built entirely out of your own accurate assessment of the pattern, independent of any confirmation from someone who may never be capable of providing it clearly even if they wanted to. How this understanding changes the story you tell. It's worth noticing directly how the understanding described throughout this piece changes the actual story you tell about this relationship, both to yourself privately and to anyone else who asks about it. The old story, the one built on the false premise that attraction and capacity are the same thing, tends to center on your own perceived inadequacy, some version of what was wrong with me that they couldn't stay. The new story, built on the more accurate distinction this piece has described throughout, centers instead on a simple, clear-eyed account. I loved someone who wanted me genuinely but lacked the developed capacity to sustain closeness over time, and that limitation was always theirs, not mine. This shift in the story you tell isn't just a matter of framing or positive thinking. It reflects a genuinely more accurate understanding of what happened, one that holds up under scrutiny far better than the self-blaming version ever did. When you tell this new story, whether internally or to someone else, notice how much lighter it feels to carry, how much less it requires you to defend or explain some presumed flaw in yourself, how much more room it leaves for straightforward grief about a genuine loss rather than tangled shame about a presumed failure. Practice telling this new story deliberately until it becomes the automatic version that comes to mind whenever this relationship is referenced, replacing the older, less accurate story that may have been running quietly in the background for longer than you realized. This is one of the more practical, actionable steps available in this entire healing process, and it's worth taking seriously as a genuine tool for consolidating everything else this piece has described. The wisdom you now carry into every future connection. Everything this piece has described adds up to a specific, valuable body of wisdom that you now carry forward into every future relationship. Wisdom that took real difficulty to earn, but that will serve you reliably for the rest of your life. You understand now, in a way many people never fully grasp, that intensity of feeling is not the same as capacity for sustained closeness, that early attraction tells you almost nothing reliable about whether a relationship can actually last. You understand that withdrawal, when it happens, usually reflects an internal limitation rather than a verdict on your worth, and that this limitation exists independently of anything you did or didn't do. You understand, too, what genuine capacity actually looks like in practice, not dramatic or intense but steady, consistent, capable of tolerating vulnerability and repairing after conflict without collapsing into withdrawal. You understand the difference between wanting and choosing, between feeling and follow-through, and you now know to look for evidence of the latter rather than being swept along purely by the former. This wisdom, hard-won through real experience, protects you in ways that abstract advice or second-hand caution never could, because it's grounded in something you actually lived through and fully understood, rather than something you simply read about once and hoped would apply. Carry this wisdom forward with confidence. It is one of the most valuable outcomes of everything you've been through, and it will continue to serve you, quietly and reliably, in every relationship you build from here forward, protecting you from repeating a pattern you now understand clearly enough to recognize and avoid, while remaining fully open to the genuine, sustainable love that pattern was always standing between you and receiving. What this means for how you see yourself now. Beyond how this understanding changes your view of future relationships, it's worth considering directly how it changes your view of yourself, right now, in the aftermath of everything you've been through. You are not someone who was insufficient, someone whose flaws finally became too much for another person to handle. You are someone who loved fully, gave generously, and remained present through real difficulty, offering exactly the kind of consistent care a healthy relationship actually requires. The fact that this offering wasn't met with equal capacity in return says everything about the limitations of the person receiving it, and nothing at all about any limitation in you. This reframing matters because self-perception, once distorted by an experience like this, tends to color far more than just your view of that one specific relationship. It can quietly shape how you approach every subsequent connection, how much you trust your own judgment, how readily you assume responsibility for outcomes that were never actually within your control. Correcting this distortion, seeing yourself clearly and accurately again, is one of the most important outcomes available from everything this piece has described, more important in many ways than any conclusion about the other person's capacity or limitations. See yourself now as you actually are, capable of deep love, genuine patience, and real emotional generosity, someone who showed up fully for a relationship that, through no fault of your own, wasn't equipped to hold what you were offering. This is an accurate, fair, and ultimately kind way of seeing yourself, and it deserves to replace whatever distorted self-perception this experience might have temporarily generated, restoring you to a clearer, more accurate sense of exactly who you are and exactly what you're capable of. The practical shape of moving forward. It's worth closing with something concrete, a practical sense of what moving forward actually looks like now that the understanding this piece has described is fully available to you. It looks like noticing, gently, whenever old self-doubt resurfaces, and countering it with the clearer, more accurate story you've built throughout this process. It looks like paying attention in new relationships, not just to intensity but to consistency, not just to how someone makes you feel in exciting early moments, but to how they behave during the harder, less flattering ones. It looks like trusting your own worth independently of any single relationship's outcome, understanding that your value was never actually determined by whether one particular person had the capacity to meet it. It looks too like patience with your own healing process, understanding that full integration of everything this piece has described takes time, repeated practice, and genuine self-compassion along the way. It looks like allowing yourself to grieve what was genuinely lost, the connection, the hope, the vision of a future that didn't materialize, while simultaneously holding the clearer understanding that this loss was never actually a referendum on your worth. Both things can be true simultaneously, and moving forward well means holding both without needing to resolve the tension between them prematurely. This is the practical shape of everything this piece has been building toward, not a single dramatic transformation, but a gradual, deliberate practice of choosing the more accurate story, again and again, until it becomes simply how you understand yourself and your own worth permanently, regardless of what any future relationship does or doesn't ultimately confirm about it. Closing word. You were wanted, that was never in question, and it doesn't need to be questioned again. What was in question, and what ultimately determined how this relationship unfolded, was someone else's capacity to sustain what that wanting promised, a capacity that existed or didn't exist independently of anything about you. This distinction, fully understood, changes everything about how you carry this experience forward, freeing you from unnecessary self-blame and restoring you to a clearer, more accurate sense of your own worth. You are capable of deep, sustained, genuine love, and you deserve to receive that same quality of love in return from someone whose capacity actually matches the depth of what they feel for you. This is not too much to ask. It is exactly what a healthy relationship is supposed to offer, and everything you've learned through this difficult experience has equipped you to recognize it, seek it out, and receive it fully when it finally arrives. Carry this understanding forward, not as a wound, but as wisdom, hard-won and genuinely valuable, ready to serve you for the rest of your life. The difference this makes for how you handle ambiguity. One of the more practical day-to-day differences this understanding makes is in how you handle ambiguity in future relationships, the ordinary uncertainty that arises whenever you're getting to know someone new and can't yet be fully sure of their capacity. In the past, ambiguity might have triggered anxious overanalysis, an attempt to resolve uncertainty through constructing hopeful interpretations of behavior that hadn't yet earned that hope. Now, armed with a clearer understanding of the distinction between attraction and capacity, you can hold ambiguity differently, allowing time and consistent behavior to reveal capacity gradually, rather than trying to resolve uncertainty prematurely through wishful interpretation. This changed relationship with ambiguity protects you from investing too quickly, too fully, in a connection whose actual capacity hasn't yet been tested by anything beyond the easier, earlier stages of getting to know someone. It allows you to enjoy new connections without needing to immediately determine whether this is the one, understanding instead that genuine capacity reveals itself over time, through repeated instances of follow-through, repair, and consistency, rather than through the intensity of early feeling alone. This patience with ambiguity is itself a form of self-protection, one that didn't come naturally before this experience, but that you've now developed through direct, difficult learning. Practicing this patience, allowing new relationships to unfold at whatever pace, actually reveals genuine capacity rather than rushing to certainty based on intensity alone, is one of the more concrete, actionable changes available to you now. It won't guarantee that every future relationship succeeds, because no amount of discernment can fully predict another person's capacity in advance. But it will protect you from investing as deeply, as quickly, in a dynamic that hasn't yet demonstrated the sustained capacity a lasting relationship actually requires, giving you more time and more information before your own emotional investment reaches a level that would make eventual disappointment as painful as what you've already been through. A final reflection on hope. It would be incomplete to end this piece without addressing hope directly, because everything described throughout carries the risk of curdling into a kind of defensive pessimism if it's not balanced with genuine, well-founded hope about what's actually possible going forward. The distinction between attraction and capacity isn't meant to make you suspicious of every future connection or convinced that genuine capacity is rare and unlikely to be found. It's meant to help you recognize genuine capacity more accurately when it does appear, which it does regularly in people who have done the work this piece has described, whether through fortunate early life experience or through deliberate, intentional effort to develop what wasn't naturally present. Hold on to real hope that you will find, or perhaps have already found, someone whose capacity genuinely matches their attraction to you, someone capable of the consistency, repair, and sustained presence that a lasting relationship actually requires. This hope isn't naive. It's grounded in the same understanding this piece has built throughout, an understanding that makes you far more capable of recognizing genuine capacity when you encounter it, precisely because you now know so clearly what its absence looks like by comparison. This hope, paired with the discernment you've built through everything you've been through, is exactly the combination that will serve you best going forward. Open enough to recognize and receive genuine love when it arrives, discerning enough to avoid investing deeply in connections that lack the capacity to sustain what they initially promise. This is not a diminished way of approaching future relationships. It is, in fact, a wiser, more mature, and ultimately more hopeful way of approaching them, built on real understanding rather than naive optimism or defensive caution alone. The support system around you now. Moving through the understanding this piece has described is easier and more sustainable when you're not doing it in isolation, and it's worth considering directly the role your support system plays in helping this new understanding fully take hold. Friends and family who reinforce the accurate story, someone who wanted you but couldn't sustain what that wanting promised, help you internalize this understanding more quickly and more fully than working through it entirely on your own. Conversely, well-meaning people who accidentally reinforce the old, less accurate story, wondering aloud what you might have done differently, or speculating about flaws in your approach that could have kept the relationship together, can inadvertently slow down the healing this piece has been describing throughout. It's worth being intentional, if possible, about who you process this experience with, seeking out people who can hold the more accurate, more compassionate framing this piece has offered, rather than people who default to the simpler but less accurate story of personal fault. This doesn't mean cutting off anyone who doesn't immediately understand this distinction, but it might mean being selective about who you turn to for deeper processing, and perhaps even sharing this framework directly with people close to you, so they can better support you in seeing this experience accurately rather than through the lens of unnecessary self-blame. Building or maintaining a support system that reinforces this accurate understanding is one of the more practical steps available to you now, helping ensure that the clarity this piece has worked to build doesn't get quietly undermined by well-intentioned but inaccurate reflections from the people around you. You deserve support that helps you see this experience clearly, and seeking that support out deliberately is a reasonable, worthwhile thing to do as you continue moving through this process. What remains unanswered and why that's fine. Despite everything this piece has described, there will likely remain some questions about this relationship that never get fully answered, details of what happened internally for the other person that you'll simply never have full access to, moments that remain genuinely ambiguous no matter how much you examine them. It's worth naming directly that this is fine, that full resolution of every remaining question was never actually necessary for the healing this piece has been describing throughout. You don't need to know every detail of what happened in order to understand the general shape of it clearly enough to move forward. You don't need a complete, itemized account of their internal experience in order to correctly identify the broader pattern at play, the mismatch between attraction and capacity that determine the relationship's outcome regardless of its specific, unknowable details. Some ambiguity is simply part of any relationship that ends without full mutual understanding, and learning to tolerate that ambiguity, rather than needing to resolve it completely before you can move forward, is itself part of the healing this piece has described. Let the remaining unanswered questions simply remain unanswered, without requiring them to be resolved before you allow yourself full peace. The broader understanding this piece has built, the distinction between attraction and capacity, the recognition that this was never about your worth, the discernment you now carry into future relationships, all of this remains true and complete regardless of whatever smaller details never get fully clarified. That's enough. It was always going to be enough. The empowerment of recognizing this pattern early next time. One of the most practically valuable outcomes of everything described throughout this piece is the ability to recognize this specific pattern much earlier in future relationships, well before significant time and emotional investment have already accumulated. Where before you might not have had the language or framework to identify what was happening until you were already deeply invested, you now carry a clear model for recognizing the early signs. Intensity that outpaces demonstrated consistency, withdrawal that intensifies as vulnerability deepens, care that coexists with an inability to sustain closeness over time. This early recognition doesn't guarantee that you'll never again find yourself attracted to someone with a genuine capacity gap. Attraction, as this piece has explained throughout, operates somewhat independently of capacity, which means you may still occasionally feel drawn to someone whose capacity ultimately proves insufficient. But recognizing the pattern early gives you the opportunity to make a more informed choice about how much to invest, how quickly to deepen the relationship, and how closely to monitor for the specific signs that indicate a capacity gap before that gap has had the chance to cause the same depth of pain this particular experience caused you. This empowerment, the ability to recognize and respond to this pattern earlier and more skillfully than before, is one of the most concrete, practical gifts available from everything you've been through. It won't prevent every future disappointment, because no framework can fully guarantee that. But it equips you with tools you didn't have before, tools built out of real, direct experience rather than second-hand advice, and those tools will serve you well in every relationship you build from here forward. Returning to yourself fully. As this piece comes to its close, it's worth returning one final time to you specifically, standing at the end of everything this experience has taught you, equipped now with a clearer, more accurate understanding of what happened and why, freed from the unnecessary self-blame that might have accompanied this experience without the framework this piece has provided. You are not diminished by having loved someone whose capacity couldn't match his attraction to you. You are, if anything, more capable now than before, carrying forward a discernment and a self-understanding that will serve you for the rest of your life. Return fully to yourself now, to the version of you who knows her own worth clearly, who understands the difference between being wanted and being kept, who carries forward real hope alongside real discernment as she moves into whatever comes next. This return doesn't require anything further from the person this experience was about. It simply requires your own continued practice of choosing the accurate story again and again until it becomes simply how you understand yourself permanently and completely. You were wanted, you deserve to be kept. The fact that you weren't says everything about a limitation that belonged to someone else, and nothing at all about your own worth or your own capacity to be loved well by someone actually equipped to do so. Carry this understanding forward fully and without hesitation into everything that comes next. The quiet confidence of understanding your own value. There is a specific quiet confidence available to anyone who has fully absorbed the distinction this piece has described throughout, a confidence that doesn't depend on external validation or on any particular relationship's outcome, because it's grounded in an accurate understanding of your own worth rather than in whether any specific person happen to have the capacity to meet it. This confidence shows up in small, everyday ways, less anxious rumination about what you might have done wrong, less searching for validation from people who have already demonstrated they can't offer it consistently, more groundedness in your own sense of what you deserve from a relationship. This confidence isn't arrogance or invulnerability. It doesn't mean you'll never feel uncertain or hurt again in future relationships. It means you carry a stable foundation underneath whatever uncertainty or hurt does arise, a foundation built on the accurate understanding that your worth was never actually determined by this relationship's outcome and won't be determined by any single future relationship's outcome either. This foundation protects you from the kind of complete self-doubt that characterized the aftermath of this particular experience, replacing it with a steadier, more resilient sense of your own value that can weather future disappointment without collapsing entirely. Building and maintaining this confidence is an ongoing practice, not a permanent state you achieve once and never have to tend to again. But you now have the tools, the understanding, and the direct experience necessary to maintain it, returning to this accurate self-assessment whenever old doubt tries to resurface, gradually strengthening this foundation until it becomes simply how you move through the world, confident in your own worth regardless of what any individual relationship ultimately reveals about someone else's capacity. To meet it, what this piece has really been about. At its core, everything described throughout this piece has really been about one central idea: separating your worth from someone else's limitation, clearly, permanently, and completely. The title's distinction between losing attraction and losing capacity was never really about explaining someone else's psychology in exhaustive detail. It was about giving you a framework accurate enough to release you from a story that was never true, the story where their inability to sustain closeness somehow reflected a deficiency in you rather than a limitation entirely their own. This reframing matters more than any specific detail about relational psychology, more than any particular insight into attachment patterns or capacity development. What matters most is the practical outcome. You now carry forward a clearer, more accurate, more compassionate understanding of your own worth, freed from unnecessary self-blame, equipped with genuine discernment for future relationships, and grounded in a confidence that doesn't depend on anyone else's capacity to validate it. This outcome, more than anything else, is the real point of everything this piece has tried to offer. Carry this outcome forward as the true takeaway from everything you've read here. You were wanted, genuinely and completely, by someone whose capacity simply couldn't match that wanting. That was never about you, it was always about them. And you, having fully understood this distinction, are now free to move forward, whole and clear-eyed, toward the kind of love that finally, fully matches everything you're capable of giving and everything you deserve to receive in return. When the understanding finally settles in, there will likely come a moment further along in this process than where you might be right now, when everything described throughout this piece stops feeling like something you have to actively remind yourself of and starts feeling instead like simply how you understand what happened automatically, without conscious effort. This is the moment when the intellectual understanding this piece has provided finally becomes fully integrated, no longer requiring deliberate practice to access, but simply present, quietly, as part of your permanent understanding of yourself and what you experienced. You'll know this moment has arrived when the old questions, the wondering about what you did wrong, the searching for a personal flaw that could explain the outcome, simply stop arising with the frequency and intensity they once had. You'll know it's arrived when you can discuss this relationship, if you ever need to, with the calm clarity of someone recounting an accurate, understood story rather than the anxious uncertainty of someone still searching for an explanation. This settling in doesn't happen on any predictable timeline, but it does happen, gradually, the same way every other part of healing described throughout this piece happens, through repeated practice, patience, and the accumulation of time. When this moment arrives for you, let it be a quiet confirmation of everything you've worked through to get here. You built this clarity deliberately, through real effort and real patience with yourself, and its eventual, full integration is not an accident but the direct result of the work you've done. Trust that it's coming, even on days when it still feels distant, because it is, in fact, exactly where this entire process has been leading you all along. The real ending. The real ending to this story was never going to be about what happened to the person whose capacity couldn't match his attraction to you. It was always going to be about what happened to you, about the understanding you built, the discernment you developed, the confidence you reclaimed in your own worth, all of it earned through real difficulty, but genuinely, permanently yours now, regardless of anything that happens next in anyone else's life. This is where the story actually concludes, not with a verdict on someone else, but with a clearer, stronger, more self-possessed version of you, ready to carry everything you've learned into whatever comes next. You were wanted, you deserve to be kept. And though you weren't by this particular person at this particular time, that outcome reflects nothing about your worth and everything about a limitation that was never yours to fix or explain. Carry this understanding forward, fully integrated and completely your own, into a future built on the discernment, confidence, and self-knowledge this entire experience has ultimately given you. That is the real gift underneath everything this piece has described, and it belongs to you now, permanently, regardless of anything else that ever happens. A note on compassion for the version of you who didn't know this yet. Before this piece fully closes, it's worth extending some direct compassion toward the version of yourself who lived through this relationship without yet having access to the framework described throughout this piece, the version who searched anxiously for personal fault, who replayed conversations looking for the moment things went wrong, who carried unnecessary self-blame simply because she didn't yet have the language or understanding to correctly attribute the outcome to something other than her own inadequacy. That version of you deserves gentleness, not embarrassment, for not having known then what you know now. Nobody arrives at this kind of understanding automatically. It develops through direct experience, through the difficult, sometimes painful process of living through exactly the kind of mismatch this piece has described, and then doing the further work of making sense of it accurately. The version of you who was still in the confusion of this experience, still searching for personal fault, was doing the best she could with the understanding available to her at the time, and she deserves credit, not criticism, for eventually finding her way to the clarity this piece has offered. Extend this compassion generously because it matters. Healing isn't just about correcting the intellectual understanding of what happened. It's also about making peace with every version of yourself who moved through this experience before that understanding was available, honoring the difficulty of not knowing what you know now, and forgiving yourself fully for whatever unnecessary self-blame you carried during the period before this clarity arrived. Final reflections on the journey. Everything described throughout this piece represents a journey, not a single moment of realization, but an accumulated process of understanding, grief, discernment, and eventual peace, built gradually out of real reflection and real patience with yourself along the way. This journey doesn't end neatly on a specific day, with a clear before and after. It continues, gradually integrating more fully over time, occasionally revisited when new situations trigger old questions, but growing steadier and more automatic with each return. You are somewhere along this journey now, wherever you happen to be reading this, whether at the very beginning of untangling this experience or well along toward the full integration this piece has described. Wherever you are, trust that the journey is real, that the destination described throughout this piece is genuinely achievable, and that you are already, through the simple act of engaging with this understanding, moving steadily toward it. Carry this journey forward with patience and self-compassion, trusting that the clarity, discernment, and confidence this piece has described will continue to deepen with time, becoming more fully your own with every day that passes. This is the real work of healing from an experience like this, and you are already, undeniably, doing it. What genuine repair looks like, and why its absence mattered. It's worth spending more time on one specific element of capacity that often determines, more than almost anything else, whether a relationship can actually sustain itself over time. The capacity for genuine repair after conflict or disappointment. Repair means actively re-engaging after a rupture, acknowledging impact, adjusting behavior where needed, and rebuilding closeness rather than simply waiting for the discomfort to fade on its own or for the other person to eventually let it go without any acknowledgement at all. Genuine repair requires a specific kind of vulnerability, the willingness to sit inside the discomfort of having disappointed someone and address that discomfort directly rather than avoiding it. A capacity gap around repair often looks, from the outside, like a pattern of conflicts that never quite resolve, that simply fade into an uneasy quiet until the next one arises, each one adding a little more accumulated distance rather than being genuinely worked through and released. Over time, this pattern erodes trust in a particular insidious way, not through any single dramatic betrayal, but through the slow accumulation of unaddressed ruptures, each one a small confirmation that repair, real repair, isn't something this relationship is equipped to offer. If this pattern characterized your own experience, it's worth naming clearly, because it likely explains a great deal about why the relationship ultimately couldn't sustain itself despite whatever genuine attraction and care were also present. Repair capacity is one of the most crucial and most commonly underdeveloped components of relational capacity, and its absence, more than almost any single dramatic event, tends to be what ultimately determines whether a relationship survives its inevitable difficult moments or slowly erodes under their accumulated weight. Recognizing repair capacity in future partners. Given how central repair capacity is to a relationship's long-term sustainability, it's worth learning to actively assess for it in future partners, paying attention specifically to how someone handles the aftermath of disappointing you, however minor the initial disappointment might be. Do they initiate reconnection after a conflict, or do they wait passively for you to do that labor? Do they acknowledge specific impact, naming clearly what they understand they did that caused hurt, or do they offer vague, general apologies that avoid any real specificity? Do they adjust their behavior over time in response to feedback, or does the same pattern simply repeat itself despite repeated conversations about it? These questions, applied honestly and consistently as you get to know someone new, offer far more reliable information about long-term compatibility than almost anything else available to you in a relationship's early stages. Genuine repair capacity is one of the clearest, most practical markers of the broader relational capacity this piece has been describing throughout, and learning to assess for it directly, rather than simply hoping it will be present, is one of the most protective habits you can develop going forward. This assessment doesn't require interrogating every new person you meet, or treating early relationships like formal evaluations. It simply means paying closer attention than you might have before to how someone handles the small, ordinary moments of friction that any relationship inevitably produces, using those moments as genuine information about capacity rather than dismissing them as insignificant simply because the relationship is still new and exciting. The last word on what you're building now. As this piece truly closes, it's worth naming clearly what you're actually building now in the aftermath of everything described throughout. A life and a set of relationships grounded in accurate self-understanding, genuine discernment, and a clear standard for what you deserve from anyone who wants to be close to you. This is not a smaller or more guarded life than the one you had before. It is, in every meaningful way, a fuller one, built on a foundation of self-knowledge that took real difficulty to earn, but that will serve you, reliably and permanently, for the rest of your life. You are building this now deliberately, out of everything this experience has taught you, carrying forward the wisdom without carrying forward the wound, understanding clearly that you were genuinely wanted and simply not, by this particular person at this particular time, kept, and that this outcome was never actually about your worth. This understanding is yours now, complete and permanent, ready to inform every relationship you build from here forward, protecting you from repeating a pattern you now understand clearly enough to recognize, while remaining fully open to the genuine, sustainable love this understanding has equipped you to finally find. The difference between settling and discerning. As you move forward with the understanding this piece has offered, it's worth addressing directly a fear that sometimes surfaces alongside this kind of clarity. The fear that holding a higher standard for capacity, alongside attraction, will somehow leave you overly critical, unable to give anyone a fair chance, perpetually finding fault before genuine. E-connection has time to develop. This fear deserves a clear response, because there is an important difference between healthy discernment and reflexive rejection, and understanding that difference protects you from swinging too far in the opposite direction of what this piece has been describing. Discernment means paying attention to real evidence over time, noticing genuine patterns, rather than dismissing someone based on a single early misstep that everyone is entitled to make while still getting to know a new person. It means giving people reasonable opportunities to demonstrate capacity through their actual behavior, rather than assuming its absence before any real evidence has accumulated one way or another. Settling, by contrast, means ignoring accumulating evidence of a genuine capacity gap because the attraction feels too good to walk away from, the exact pattern this piece has spent so much time describing. The opposite extreme, reflexive rejection, means refusing to extend the reasonable trust and patience that any early relationship requires in order for real capacity to have the chance to reveal itself at all. Finding the balance between these extremes means staying genuinely open to new people, extending real chances for connection to develop, while paying honest attention to the patterns that emerge over time rather than ignoring them in favor of hope alone. This balance takes practice, and it's worth checking in with yourself periodically about which side of it you might be leaning toward, adjusting as needed to ensure you're neither settling for insufficient capacity nor closing yourself off from genuine connection out of an overcorrected fear of repeating this experience. Where you stand now. You stand now at the end of everything described throughout this piece, with a clearer, more complete understanding of what happened in this relationship than you likely had when it first ended. You understand the distinction between attraction and capacity, and you understand which one was genuinely present and which one was missing. You understand that this outcome was never a verdict on your worth, and you carry forward a discernment that will protect and serve you in every future relationship you build. You understand what genuine capacity actually looks like, and you know now how to recognize it, distinct from the intensity of early attraction alone. This is where you stand, and it is a genuinely good place to stand, built out of real difficulty but resulting in real, lasting clarity. Whatever comes next in your life, whoever eventually proves capable of matching both attraction and capacity in the way you deserve, you'll meet that possibility from this stronger, clearer place, equipped with everything this experience has taught you, ready to receive the kind of sustained, consistent love you've always deserved and now know exactly how to recognize. A closing thought on self-trust. Everything this piece has described ultimately points toward a deeper form of self-trust, one that doesn't depend on external confirmation of your worth, one that remains stable regardless of what any individual relationship reveals about someone else's capacity to meet it. This self-trust is perhaps the most valuable, most durable outcome available from everything you've been through, more valuable even than the specific understanding of attraction versus capacity, because it will serve you across every domain of your life, not just in romantic relationships. Trusting yourself means believing your own perception of what happened over any external explanation, or lack of one, that might otherwise be offered. It means trusting your own worth independently of any single relationship's outcome. It means trusting your own capacity for discernment as you move into future connections, believing that you can recognize genuine capacity when you encounter it, informed by everything this difficult experience has taught you. This trust, once fully rebuilt, becomes a permanent resource, carried forward into every future challenge life presents, not just the specific challenge of building healthy romantic relationships. Carry this self-trust forward as the final, most important gift available from everything described throughout this piece. You've earned it through real difficulty and real reflection, and it belongs to you now permanently, ready to support you through whatever comes next. Closing. You were wanted fully and genuinely, and you were not kept, not because of anything lacking in you, but because of a capacity that was never fully developed in someone else. This distinction, now fully understood, frees you to move forward with your worth intact, your discernment sharpened, and your hope for genuine, sustainable love fully justified by everything you now know about what that love actually requires. Carry this understanding forward, complete and permanently yours, into whatever comes next. Carrying this forward into ordinary days. Beyond the significant, reflective moments this piece has focused on, it's worth considering how this understanding shows up in the ordinary texture of daily life, long after the most acute period of processing this relationship has passed. It shows up in a passing thought triggered by something unrelated that used to carry a sting and now simply passes through without much weight at all. It shows up in how you talk about past relationships with new people you're getting to know, offering the accurate, settled version of the story rather than a version still tangled up in unresolved self-doubt. It shows up in small moments of confidence, choices made without hesitation, because you trust your own judgment more fully than you did before this experience forced you to rebuild it. These ordinary, undramatic instances are where healing actually lives, more than in any single moment of dramatic realization. The understanding this piece has described isn't meant to remain an abstract framework you occasionally recall. It's meant to become woven into the fabric of how you move through ordinary days, informing small decisions and small moments of self-perception until it stops requiring any conscious effort to access at all. Notice these ordinary moments as they accumulate. They are the real evidence of everything this piece has been working to describe, more reliable than any single insight or realization, because they reflect a transformation that has become genuinely integrated into how you actually live, not just how you think about what happened when you deliberately turn your attention toward it. The truest thing to remember. If you remember nothing else from everything described throughout this piece, remember this: wanting and keeping are different capacities, and you were never responsible for the gap between them and someone else. You gave real love, real patience, and real presence to someone whose capacity to sustain what he felt toward you simply wasn't equal to the feeling itself. This was never a reflection of your worth. It was always only a reflection of a limitation that belonged entirely to him, present before you arrived and likely to persist in some form long after you're gone from his life. You are capable of deep, sustained, genuine love, and you deserve exactly that in return from someone whose capacity finally matches what they feel for you. Carry this truth forward, complete and unshakable, into everything that comes next, what you'll notice a year from now. It's worth imagining, briefly, what you might notice about your own healing a year from wherever you are right now, because that longer view can offer real encouragement during a process that sometimes feels slow while you're inside it. A year from now, you'll likely notice that this relationship has become simply a chapter in your history, referenced occasionally, but no longer central to how you understand your own worth or your own capacity to be loved. You'll notice that the framework this piece has described has become so fully integrated that you barely have to think about it anymore, simply operating from a place of accurate self-understanding without needing to consciously access the reasoning behind it. You'll likely notice, too, a different quality of relationship in your life by then, whether that's a new romantic connection built on genuine mutual capacity or simply a deepened sense of peace within yourself, independent of whether a new relationship has yet arrived. Either outcome reflects the same underlying transformation this piece has been describing throughout, a return to your own accurate sense of worth, no longer distorted by an experience that, however painful, never actually reflected anything true about your value. Let this longer view offer encouragement during whatever stage of this process you're currently in. The destination described throughout this piece is real, reachable, and, if you're doing the work this piece has outlined, already underway. Trust that a year from now, looking back, you'll recognize clearly how far you've traveled from wherever you're standing today. Final closing. This is where the piece ends, not with speculation about anyone else's future, but with a clear, complete understanding of your own. You were wanted, you deserved to be kept, and the fact that you weren't reflects a limitation that was never yours to carry. Carry forward instead the clarity, the discernment, and the self-trust this entire process has given you, ready now for whatever comes next, whole and completely your own. One more word on being gentle with the timeline. It bears repeating one final time that everything described throughout this piece unfolds on its own timeline, different for every person, shaped by countless individual factors that have nothing to do with how thoroughly you've understood the concepts themselves. Some people move through this process more quickly, others more slowly, and neither pace reflects anything about how much you loved, how deeply you were hurt, or how capable you are of eventually reaching the clarity and peace this piece has described. Be gentle with your own particular timeline, resisting the urge to compare your progress against some imagined standard of how quickly this understanding is supposed to settle in. What matters is not speed but direction, the consistent, gradual movement toward the accurate understanding this piece has offered, even when that movement feels slow or uneven from week to week. Trust that direction over any particular timeline, knowing that the destination remains the same regardless of how long the journey toward it actually takes for you specifically. The very last thing. Let this be the very last thing you carry forward from everything written here. You are not defined by someone else's incapacity to keep you. You are defined by your own capacity to love fully, to grow through real difficulty, and to arrive, eventually, at a clearer, more accurate understanding of your own worth. That capacity was never in question. It remains yours now, fully intact, ready to carry you forward into whatever comes next, complete and entirely your own. A brief word on self-care during this process. As you continue moving through everything described throughout this piece, it's worth naming a few concrete forms of self-care that tend to support this kind of healing most effectively, not as a prescriptive checklist, but as gentle suggestions worth considering. Physical movement, even simple daily walks, helps process the nervous system activation that often accompanies this kind of emotional work, giving your body a way to metabolize stress that talking alone sometimes can't fully address. Journaling, specifically writing out the accurate story described throughout this piece in your own words, helps reinforce that understanding more deeply than passive reading alone, giving you the chance to actively construct the narrative in language that feels genuinely your own. Connection with people who see you clearly, who reflect back your worth accurately rather than reinforcing old doubts, remains one of the most valuable resources available during this process. So does simple patience, permission to have difficult days without treating them as evidence of failed healing. Understanding that setbacks and difficult moments are a normal part of any genuine transformation rather than signs that something has gone wrong. None of these practices are mandatory, and everyone's healing looks slightly different depending on their own preferences, resources, and circumstances. But it's worth considering, honestly, whether you're offering yourself the kind of care this process actually requires, rather than expecting the intellectual understanding this piece has provided to do all the work on its own, without any accompanying practical support for the emotional and physical dimensions of this healing as well. The understanding you now carry, complete. Everything this piece has offered comes together now into a single, complete understanding, ready to be carried forward into whatever comes next in your life. You loved someone whose attraction to you was genuine, but whose capacity to sustain that attraction into lasting closeness was limited by factors entirely outside your control. This limitation was never a verdict on your worth. It was simply a gap, common enough, unfortunate enough, but never a reflection of anything insufficient about you or about the love you offered. You carry forward from this experience real wisdom about the difference between wanting and keeping, real discernment for recognizing genuine capacity in future relationships, and real confidence in your own worth, independent of any single relationship's outcome. This is the complete understanding this piece has worked to offer, and it belongs to you now, permanently, ready to support you through everything that comes next, whole, clear-eyed, and entirely your own. What to say when someone asks you what happened? It's worth offering something practical here, a brief guide for how to respond when someone, whether a new friend, a potential new partner, or simply a curious acquaintance, asks you directly what happened in this relationship. You don't owe anyone a lengthy, detailed accounting, but having a clear, accurate, brief version ready can help you avoid falling back into an old, less accurate story simply because you haven't consciously prepared a better one. Something like, we cared about each other genuinely, but the relationship needed a kind of consistency he wasn't able to offer, and I've made peace with understanding that as his limitation rather than mine, communicates the essential truth without requiring extensive detail or reopening old wounds unnecessarily. Having this kind of brief, accurate summary ready protects you from either oversharing painful details with someone who doesn't need them, or falling back into a vaguer, more self-blaming version simply because you haven't thought through what you actually want to say. It also reinforces, every time you say it, the accurate understanding this piece has worked to build, strengthening that understanding through repeated, deliberate articulation rather than letting it remain only a private, internal framework you've never had to put into words for anyone else. Practice saying some version of this to yourself, even before anyone asks, so that when the moment does come, you have language ready that reflects the clarity you've built rather than defaulting to an older, less accurate story out of simple habit or lack of preparation. Gratitude for what this taught you without gratitude for the pain. It's worth closing with an honest distinction between two things that sometimes get conflated in discussions of growth through difficulty. Gratitude for the lessons this experience ultimately taught you, and gratitude for the pain itself. You don't have to be grateful that this happened, don't have to construct some spiritual narrative where the suffering was somehow necessary or deserved in order to produce the growth that followed. The pain was real and it was genuinely difficult, and none of that needs to be reframed as secretly a gift in order for you to also recognize the genuine value of what you learned as a result of surviving it. You can hold both truths simultaneously. This was hard and it shouldn't have had to be this hard, and also, having gone through it, you now carry forward real wisdom, real discernment, and real self-understanding that will serve you well beyond this particular chapter. Neither truth cancels out the other, and you don't need to pretend the difficulty was worth it in some cosmic sense in order to still value what you've built out of surviving it. Carry both truths forward honestly, without needing to resolve the tension between them. The pain was real, the growth is also real. Both can simply exist, side by side, as you move forward into whatever comes next, wiser and more grounded than you were before, without needing to be thankful for the difficulty that got you here. The simple truth that started this piece. This piece began with a simple distinction, one worth restating clearly now that everything else has been said. Attraction and capacity are not the same thing, and confusing them is one of the most common, most painful mistakes people make when trying to understand why a relationship they believed in didn't survive. You were attracted to and attractive to someone who wanted you genuinely. That much was never in doubt. What was missing was the harder, less visible capacity required to sustain that wanting into something lasting, a capacity that exists independently of desire, built through a different kind of internal work that not everyone has done. This simple distinction, fully understood, changes everything about how you carry this experience forward, and it's worth returning to again and again, whenever old doubt tries to blur the line between these two separate things. You were wanted, you deserve to be kept. Those two facts were never actually in contradiction, and understanding why is the entire foundation this piece has been built upon, from its very first words to these final ones. Where you go from here. From here, you go forward carrying everything this piece has offered: the distinction between attraction and capacity, the release from unnecessary self-blame, the discernment to recognize genuine capacity in future relationships, and the confidence to trust your own worth regardless of what any single relationship ultimately reveals about someone else's limitations. This is where the story ends and where your own continues, built now on a foundation of real understanding rather than lingering confusion, ready for whatever comes next in a life that remains fully and completely your own. A closing word of encouragement. Whatever stage of this process you're in right now, whether just beginning to consider this distinction for the first time or well along toward the full integration this piece has described, trust that the clarity you're building is real and durable. It doesn't depend on anyone else's confirmation, doesn't require anyone else's growth or eventual understanding, doesn't wait on any external validation to become fully true for you. It's yours already, built out of your own honest reflection, ready to support you through everything that comes next. You are capable of this healing, exactly as capable as anyone who has ever walked this particular path before you. The difficulty of what you experience doesn't disqualify you from reaching the peace this piece has described. If anything, it qualifies you more fully, because you now understand from direct experience exactly what this distinction means and why it matters. Carry that understanding forward with confidence, trusting that it will continue to deepen and settle in more fully with each day that passes, until it becomes simply, permanently, how you understand yourself and what you deserve. Final words. You are wanted, you deserve to be kept. And though this particular story didn't end that way, the reason had nothing to do with your worth and everything to do with a capacity gap that belonged entirely to someone else. Carry this understanding forward, complete and unshakable, into a future built on real clarity, real discernment, and a fully restored sense of exactly what you deserve. The last reflection. Somewhere ahead of you is a version of this understanding so fully settled that you'll barely remember what it felt like to doubt it. A version of yourself so grounded in her own worth that questions about what was wrong with you simply won't arise anymore, replaced entirely by the accurate, complete understanding this piece has worked to build. That version of you is not a distant fantasy. She's already forming, built out of every honest reflection you've engaged in throughout this process, growing steadier with each day that passes. Trust her, trust the process that's building her, and carry forward from this moment onward the simple, complete truth this entire piece has tried to offer. You were never the reason this ended. You were simply loved by someone whose capacity couldn't match what he felt, and that will always only be his story to carry, not yours. Closing line. Carry this forward, complete and finally understood. You were wanted, fully and genuinely, and the capacity to keep you was never something you failed to earn. It was simply something that was never fully there to give, and that absence belongs permanently and entirely to someone else's story, not to yours. Final note. May you carry this understanding lightly now, no longer a wound but simply a piece of hard-won wisdom, informing how you love and how you allow yourself to be loved, for the rest of a life that belongs completely and permanently to you. The end. This is where the story rests now, understood fully, carried gently, no longer a source of doubt but a source of quiet, hard-earned clarity. You were wanted, you deserved to be kept, and now at last you understand exactly why one of those things was true and the other, through no fault of your own, simply wasn't. You go forward now whole, wiser, and completely your own, ready for whatever comes next, carrying nothing but the truth and everything you deserve still fully ahead of you. Nothing further needs to be said. The understanding is complete and it is yours now and always. May it serve you well, quietly and completely for the rest of your life. You are at last entirely free. Closing thought. Take this understanding with you into the rest of your life, not as a burden to carry but as a lantern that lights the way forward, showing you clearly what to look for and what to walk past, what deserves your full heart and what never should have been allowed to cost you so much of it in the first place. You know now. And knowing fully and completely is enough to carry you the rest of the way home. Go now and live it. You are ready.